the word came before she did. Verity Fenn was cataloguing spines in the long gallery when she heard the Duke of Aldermere tell his steward that he did not want a wife who talked. She did not yet know that the sentence had already chosen her, and had she known she would have gone on turning pages all the same, for that was the whole of her defect and the whole of her gift. She noticed everything and interrupted nothing. 40 days, the steward was saying, before Martinmas, before the county trustees, sat to confirm Lady Rosalind's guardianship for another 3 years, and a duke who arrived at that table with gossip trailing him like smoke behind a snuffed candle would arrive with nothing at all. "I require," said the duke, in the flat, unhurried voice of a man who had never once needed to raise it, "a household that says nothing, because I have nothing further to give the county to talk about." Verity's hand had stopped on the spine of a ledger bound in green vellum, and she stood very still behind the door that did not quite meet its frame, the way she had stood still her whole life in rooms where she was not wanted, and had learned, long before this house, that stillness was cheaper than being noticed and asked to leave. She was 26, poor as a church mouse and twice as quiet, and she had been at Aldermere 11 weeks cataloguing a library nobody else in the house could be troubled to read, on wages that would end the day the cataloguing did, which, by her own reckoning, was in perhaps a fortnight. The steward, a neat gray man named Aldous Creed, who wore his watch chain the way other men wore medals, said that a wife who talked was easily found and easily regretted, and that a wife who did not talk was harder to find, but once found, was worth any price a man cared to pay for her. "And there is one under this roof already," he said, and something in the mildness of it made the hair rise on Verity's arms, for she understood. With the cold clarity of a woman who has spent a life going unremarked in other people's rooms, that they were discussing her. She did not hear the rest. A footman came round the gallery with an armful of wood for the grate, and she moved off along the shelves as though she had been reading the whole time, her heart going hard and small and fast, like a bird that has flown into a closed window and cannot yet believe the sky was glass. Aldermere in that first autumn was a house that held its breath. She had felt it the day she arrived, in the way the servants lowered their voices past the east wing, in the way the young Lady Rosalind was walked in the garden at fixed hours by a nurse who counted her steps, in the way every clock in the house kept a slightly different time except for one, a bracket clock in the winter parlor that was always, uncannily, exact, because the Duke himself opened its case and set it alone on Sunday evenings, with the same unhurried hands he used for everything else. She had catalogued 4,000 volumes in that library by the second week of November, and had begun, without meaning to, cataloguing the house itself, which doors were kept locked, which servants flinched at Mr. Creed's step, which room held the still-room ledger she was forbidden, gently but firmly, to shelve herself. Her father had taught her to read a hand the way other men read a face, the weight of a pen stroke, the tell of an ink gone brown at a different rate than its neighbor on the page, and it was a talent that had once ruined him, and now, though she did not yet know it, was going to save a girl she had not yet properly met. She thought of her father rarely and on purpose, the way one keeps a small coal banked rather than let it go entirely out. He had been the finest archivist in 3 counties until a great house missing certain deeds had needed someone convenient to blame. And he had died 4 years later in 2 rented rooms with his daughter reading to him, because his own eyes had gone, still repeating the one thing he had taught her to believe past all discouragement. "The way out is through the middle," he used to say, "in the light, with witnesses." It was, she privately thought, a strange thing to teach a girl with no fortune and no beauty to speak of, and no family left to vouch for her, a doctrine built for courtrooms handed down to someone who would likely never see the inside of one. She was still turning that thought over, and the ledger's green spine, and the word silence lying in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. When the same footman found her 40 minutes later and told her, with the particular blankness servants keep for messages they do not understand themselves, that his grace required her in his study directly, she set down her pen so the nib would not dry, squared the pages of her catalogue corner to corner the way she squared everything before she rose to meet a thing she did not want to meet, and went down through the house toward a room she had never once been asked to enter, past the winter parlor where the one true clock ticked its patient exact seconds, not yet knowing that she was walking, quite literally, toward the sentence that had already been spoken about her before she had ever been asked. The study door stood open a hand's width, throwing one long blade of firelight across the corridor floor, and from within it she heard the Duke's voice, low and even, say her name for the first time in her hearing, the way a man says a word he has already decided to keep. The room smelled of leather, tallow, and the particular cold that clung to houses too large for the fires that tried to warm them. The Duke of Aldermere stood at the window with his back to the door, a tall man built like something meant to bear weight, and he did not turn when she came in, only said, "You may sit," in the tone of a man accustomed to obedience arriving before he had finished the sentence. Verity did not sit. It was, she would later understand, the first thing about her that surprised him. "I was told your grace required me," she said. He turned then. His face was the kind that had likely been called handsome before grief had gone over it with a plane, smoothing away whatever had once been careless in it, and his eyes when they found her were the still gray of a pond before weather. "Miss Fenn," he said, "you have been 11 weeks in my library." 11 weeks and 3 days, she said, and watched something flicker at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile and did not become one. "You keep a precise accounting," he said. "It is the only inheritance I was left," she said, "that nobody has yet found a way to take from me." He studied her a moment as if she were a page whose hand he could not immediately place, and then he said the thing plainly. Without preamble, the way she would come to learn, he said everything that mattered to him. "I am to be married before Martinmas." He let that sit a moment, the fire ticking in the grate, and then he added, "I have not chosen a bride from love, Miss Fenn, and I will not pretend to you that I intend to look for one there. I require a wife of good enough birth to satisfy the trustees, poor enough to be grateful for the settlement, and quiet enough that my house does not become, in the process, a subject." "There is a great deal in this house," he said, "that must not be spoken of, and I have not the leisure to teach discretion to a woman who has not already learned it the hard way." She felt the floor of the conversation shift under her, the way ground shifts under a foot that has stepped wrong on ice, and she said, careful and even, "And why, Your Grace, do you imagine I have learned it?" "Because," he said, "you have stood behind 3 doors in this house in the last 2 months, listening to things that were not your business, and repeated not one word of any of them to anyone below stairs, and I have made it my business to know that, because I make it my business to know everything that happens under this roof." It was not an accusation. It was, she realized with something like vertigo, closer to a compliment, delivered in the voice of a man who did not know how to give one any other way. "I married you for your silence," he said at last, "though we are not yet married, and I would have you understand the bargain before you agree to it, because I will not have it said afterward that you did not know the terms. Settlement, protection, a name, and a house. In return, discretion, patience with a household that keeps its own counsel, and no salon, no callers. No curiosity about doors I have not opened to you myself. Verity stood very still, the way she had stood behind that gallery door 2 hours before, and thought of her father dying in 2 rented rooms because a great house had needed someone convenient, and thought that here was another great house offering her, at least, the dignity of being asked. "And if I refuse," she said, "then you will have cost me an afternoon and yourself a position," he said, "for I imagine Mrs. Ferris will not keep the cataloging on past the new year regardless. It was not cruelty. It was arithmetic, delivered without relish, and she respected it more than she wanted to." "I will want one thing added to the terms," she said, and watched his brows lift a fraction, as though no one in some years had added anything to his terms rather than simply accepted them. "Say it," he said. "That whatever I am not to ask about," she said, "I am at least to be told is there, so that I do not stumble into it blind and call it my own carelessness afterward." Something crossed his face then that she would only later learn to name, not warmth, not yet, but the particular stillness of a man recalculating an opponent's worth mid-hand. "Agreed," he said. "There is a room in the east wing you will not enter, and a sister you will meet under supervision only, and a physician's ledger you are not to read, and I tell you this so that you may call it, as you say, known rather than stumbled into." It was, she thought, walking back to the library an hour later, with the betrothal settled and her whole life reorganized between one bell and the next, the strangest proposal ever made to a woman with nothing, and the fairest one she had ever been offered, and she did not yet understand that a bargain built on silence, in a house already too full of things unspoken, was the kind of arithmetic that could not, in the end, be made to balance. Old Mrs. Nettlefold, who had kept house at Aldermere since the Duke was in short coats, and considered discretion a virtue best exercised on other people's behalf, met her in the still-room passage with her arms full of linen and her opinion, as usual, close behind it. "So he has bought himself a quiet wife," she said, without looking up from her folding. "Bought is an ungenerous word," Verity said. "It is the accurate one," said Mrs. Nettlefold, "and I have found accuracy saves a deal of time, in households and elsewhere." She looked up then, taking Verity's measure the way she might a bolt of cloth, checking it for moth holes before committing to the cutting. "He will get more silence out of you than he bargains for, girl, and less than he thinks, and by spring he will not know which he is more surprised by." "And what will you be surprised by, Mrs. Nettlefold?" Verity asked, and the old woman's mouth twitched, the closest thing to a smile she rationed out before noon. "That," said Mrs. Nettlefold, "I intend to enjoy finding out at my leisure," and went on folding linen as though the whole of the future had already been ironed flat and put away in a drawer, where she alone kept the key. It was, Verity would think much later, the truest prophecy anyone offered her in that entire strange autumn, and she had been too busy squaring the corners of her own new fortune to hear it as one. Mr. Aldous Creed found her 3 days later in the library, where she had gone back to her cataloging because grief and change both, she had learned, were best survived with the hands occupied. He came in without knocking, which she noted, and stood at a companionable distance that was somehow not companionable at all. "Miss Fenn," he said, soon to be her grace. He said the title the way a man tries on another man's coat, testing where it pinched. "I wish to welcome you properly, and to offer what small guidance I can, having served this family since before his grace could walk unassisted." She thanked him, and waited, because she had learned that men who announced their goodwill at length generally had a use for you attached to the far end of it. "There is a great deal to manage in a house like this," he went on, turning a paper knife over in his fingers with the unconscious neatness of a man who could not bear an object out of true. "The accounts, the tenantry, the physician's, Lady Rosalind's particular needs. His Grace is not a man who likes to be troubled with the ledger of it, and I have carried that ledger, Miss Fenn, for a great many years, quite alone. I imagine, she said carefully, it has been a comfort to him to have it carried so well. It has been my life's occupation, said Creed, and something under the mildness of his voice went, for one instant, taut as a wire before it settled again into its usual smoothness. I say this only so that you understand there is no need for a new mistress to trouble herself with what does not concern her. The tenantry accounts, the physician's book, the stillroom stores, these are matters I have in hand, and have had in hand since before you came to this county, Miss Fenn, and will have in hand, I expect, a good while after. It was phrased as reassurance. It landed in the quiet library with its 4,000 catalogued spines as a small closed door being shut very gently in her face, and she filed the shape of it away the way she filed everything, a fact without a use yet, a stroke of ink whose meaning she could not read until she had seen more of the page. She only said, I am obliged to you, Mr. Creed, and returned to her cataloging, and did not tell him that she had already, 3 days before, seen the corner of the stillroom ledger left open on his own desk when she passed it with an armful of returned volumes, and had seen, in the space of 2 idle seconds, a column of figures for a tonic dispensed to Lady Rosalind that had climbed, month upon month since summer, in a way no ordinary prescription climbed, and had thought nothing of it at the time beyond a small cold notice, the kind a careful reader gives an ink blot before turning the page. She had not yet learned to call it a clue. She only knew, the way she knew a false binding by the give of it under her thumb, that something in that ledger did not sit true, and she went on turning the library's pages with her outward calm entirely undisturbed, and underneath it, for the first time since her father died, the old patient organ of her attention had begun, very quietly, to hum.